Hello, and welcome to the Mr. Reviews on Other Old Nikon YouTube channel. Today, we'll be looking at a pretty unique camera, the Nikon D2h. A tiny bit of background. When I was in Ottawa, I ended up picking this up from a local camera shop that sounds like Benry's. This was in November, and so I've only had this for a couple months, and it's only being used, therefore, in winter. So, FYI, the photo gallery is going to be snowy, muddy, or just winter-themed generally. For those of you unaware, the D2h is one of two cameras that use the LBCAST JFET sensor, with the other being the D2hs, making this kind of interesting. Kind of. We'll get into that in a little bit. But just in case you're not aware, it is time for me to plug my brother's YouTube channel. Yes, I have a brother. Yes, he does do YouTube. And yes, it is also camera, video, photo related. So feel free to check him out. He has his channel and it's called Chang of Fools. There'll be a link in the description. There'll also be a card here. Click there. Open up a tab, if you will, and check it out after watching this video. All right. Now, let's have a look at the D2h and that weird sensor. What is the Nikon D2h? Well, obviously it is this camera right here. The D2h is one of Nikon's flagship cameras, released in July of 2003. It features a APS-C size sensor which makes 4.1 megapixel images, using the aforementioned LBCAST JFET sensor technology. It has an ISO range of 200 to 1600, and it can boost up to 6400. The shutter is good for 30 seconds to 1/8000th of a second. It can flash sync it up to 1/250th of a second, and it can shoot at a pretty nice 8 FPS for up to 26 RAWs. That's a little over 3 seconds. Nice. To accompany that speed, the focusing system in here is the Multicam 2000, an 11-point affair, with 9 being clustered in the center being cross-type points. Nice. The metering is handled by Nikon's 3D color matrix metering system, and that features a 1005 pixel CCD to do said metering. On the back, we have a 211 K-dot display that is 2.5 inches big, and being a pro SLR body, there is a rear sub-display as well as a top plate sub-display. Both illuminate green at night, or when you turn on the light. Not at night, it doesn't do it automatically. At any rate, without the battery, this weighs in at 1.07 kilograms, or roughly 2.36 pounds. That's almost 1.1 times a plena. Hefty. And with the batteries in, which is how you'll probably be using it, it's 1200 grams, even heftier. The memory that this camera uses is compact flash, surprising no one. And the battery pack itself is the EN-EL4. According to DP Review's test, this could last for up to 2,900 shots on a charge, but I think this was done pre-SEPA testing standard days. Lastly, in 2003, when this was brand new, the camera came in at $3,500 USD, approximately $6,160 in 2026 dollar dues. The prices never cease to amaze me. In Canadian, though, that's $8,460. Ugh. LB, what, I hear you asking? let's get into that. The D2h is the first camera to use Nikon's LBCAST JFET sensor. In a quote from Nikon on their article about the sensor, they say the following: "This LBCAST sensor is developed using proprietary Nikon technology to combine high speed and high image quality with low power consumption. It is used in the D2h." So what does that mean? Well, let's discuss. The actual acronym LBCAST stands for the following: Lateral Buried Charge Accumulator and Sensing Transistor. Nice, that got all the letters. In theory, this sensor was meant to do a couple things. It was meant to accomplish one, having a higher read speed than similar CMOS sensors. It was meant to have reduced noise compared to said sensors. It was supposed to have simplified circuitry and thus therefore have increased fill factor, which, if you don't remember, is the area which light can be gathered over the area of the entire photo site. Generally speaking, that's what the sensor was meant to do. Now, I do want to point out one thing. LBCAST JFETs are not CCDs. There are some folks on the interweb who just want to associate old with CCD apparently, or they don't care. Either way, I've seen this mistakenly brought up a couple times on the interweb forums, on the Bookface pages, and just want to clear the air right now. It is not a CCD. The sensor is closer to CMOS. Both technologies are active pixel sensors, of which CCDs are not. They be passive. All right, that's all I got for this TED Talk. Goodbye! Problems with the D2h. This camera had its fair share of issues. Now, I do admit, one of these issues might actually kind of be what's making the images of the D2h look a little bit unique, but they are issues nonetheless. The first and the biggest one is that the D2h has a weak infrared filter. This is kind of a double-edged sword, if you think about it. And what it does mean, though, is that you do get quite a bit of infrared bleed through in the sensor, and it could result in some dark fabrics looking a bit magenta. It might also affect the way some skin tones may look. It may make the colors generally a bit funky, because really more infrared is getting onto the sensor than there should be. Now, this could be mitigated with infrared cutting filters, but you can also do this the other way around. If you want an infrared camera, you can use an infrared bandpass filter. And I can confirm the contamination is pretty severe. I held up one of those older remotes and I started blasting it while the shutter was open for a couple seconds. And as you can see, you can very clearly see where I pressed the button on the remote when the infrared LED powered up. It was quite a bit of IR bleeding through. While using an actual infrared bandpass filter, because I do have IR cameras, I think that this camera actually is a pretty solid infrared setup. It's pretty easy to set up since all you need is that filter to screw on your lens. And if you can push your ISO, you can actually do some of these handheld. You can get shutter speeds that are fast enough that you won't introduce that much shake into your image at all if you're, stable enough. I would still recommend getting a tripod though if you want to go look into this route, since the speeds are good, but they're not great. Also, if you do decide to look into this as a cheap IR shooter, I recommend manual glass, since a lot of them still have the infrared indicator for focus adjustment. I noticed that a lot of my AFD lenses do not do that. And just to give you an idea of what shutter speeds I was able to get, in midday through a window at ISO 400 to 800 at f2.8, I was getting somewhere between 1/60th and 1/200th of a second. So again, pretty solid speeds for capturing IR. Let's actually go back to talking about the things that are weird with this camera. The other one is annoying, but mostly harmless. Looking through forums, there's a lot of instances of the camera producing an ERR message when you first shoot the camera after powering up for an indeterminate number of time. Nobody seems to be able to peg down how long it takes for it to do it. But basically, you take a shot, it records the shot, but then it presents error on top of the display. And you have to press the shutter again before the error goes away. It's not hugely annoying, but it does take getting used to. And once you take that shot again, as long as you leave the camera on, it probably won't do it again for a little while, at least till you turn the camera off and wait a bit. Let's see if I can induce it now. All right, I'm gonna just change it to manual. It does not want to. Oh, I've twisted the aperture ring. Here we go. It did not do that. I had shot this too recently, but trust me, it is a thing. It seems to be very, very common, and like I said, all you really got to do is take a second shot and it'll go away. I'll link to some forum posts about it down below so you can have a look at what I'm talking about if I'm not being super clear, but it is kind of annoying. Again, I thought I could trigger it. I didn't shoot it for a little while and it has been off, but I have been fidgeting with this camera while being here. Maybe that had something to do with it. Operation and feel. Also, how does it look with the hair light on? Anyways, if you've seen my video on the D1X or the D3, you probably know how I feel about the Nikon square bodies. Generally, they're very well made, the layout is very sensible, the grips and the rear thumb perches are basically perfect. And oddly enough, I literally just noticed this, but on the D2h, the rear perch is made by scooping out a single part of the body right here. So that line is continuous and it looks pretty great. And I just noticed it, but that is a nice little touch. Honestly, I think the reason why I noticed the line was because of all the wear on the back of the camera, and it kind of makes an outline of where all the edges are. So that's kind of neat. Anyways, the D2h uses Nikon's pretty awesome dual command dial layout, one there and one at the back. Good stuff. The rear also uses a D-pad for navigation, and it's not bad. It's not as good as an AF joystick, but Nikon would be pretty late to that game. Although I do maintain that generally for ergonomics, the most perfect of Nikon cameras are still the D200 and D700 and that general era. At any rate, if you're looking on or looking at this camera, you might have noticed there's a little white thing over here. It's very neat. It looks interesting. Just like a little bit of jewelry, if you will. It's not though. It's the white balance sensor on this camera. So yes, this camera uses a off sensor white balance thingy, kind of like the Canon 1D, the original one, which used one like somewhere here. And for this camera, it is an easy indication that you are looking at a D2 series camera. If you see a Nikon and it has a little white dot up there, it's a D2h or D2x, or one of the subvariants of those. Additionally, being an older Nikon, the menus are super simple and easy with 4 main sections. You got your playback, shooting, custom, and setup. Additionally, playback is pretty snappy on this camera. It's quite nice. Remember, that wasn't always a guaranteed thing in 2003. Looking at you, Fujifilm. And if you're using non-CPU lenses / manual AI glass on the D2h, it will let you program the focal length and aperture into it, and it'll put it in the EXIF data of the photo. So that's kind of nice. The one thing it doesn't have though is it doesn't have that page that lets you save a bunch of preset focal lengths, so you can just toggle to your favorite manual focus lenses. Each time you have to enter the menu and you have to punch in your focal length and your aperture values for whichever lens you have on at the time. And it's a bit annoying, but I'm glad it's still there anyways. Last thing I want to point out is this camera, again being a pro camera, has voice annotation. There is a little button there that has the little microphone sign on it, and let's have a listen and see how my voice sounds with its voice annotation. Image quality and autofocus. Let's get one thing out the bag. Yes, this is 4.1 megapixels. For me, this straddles the line between usefulness and novelty. And I understand, yes, resolution isn't the be-all, end-all. I know, personally, I review a lot of old cameras, so I get it. But for me, this leans a little closer to novelty. That's just me though, and I know there are cameras that I've used in a similar megapixel range, and I think they're pretty good, but I think for this, it's just a little too close. It's too close to that novelty side. And again, if you feel that this is enough for you, by all means, yeah, don't let my stupid opinion impact how you feel about it. But what it means for me is that for social media stuff, it's super duper awesome. But for something like a 4K display, there's quite a lot of scaling up to be done. And you really don't have any cropping power. So framing up well from the get-go is required. Now, the sensor is still able to record some very nice details at the per pixel level. And I assume it's because the AA filter is a bit weak, because there is one on top of this. So scaling up generally will be okay. I just don't think that punching it all the way up to 4K display resolutions is going to look that good. Somewhere in between is probably fine. And no, I'm not talking about AI scale up, because I don't know, they'll advertise a scale up to a bajillion megapixels or whatever. When it comes to dynamic range, this camera is, as you'd expect of the era, it's a bit limited. Even if you are used to DSLRs from say 2007 to 2012 or so, this camera will remind you of its age. So you really don't have a huge amount of pushing or pulling room before things are blown or before noise kind of creeps in and makes things unhappy. That being said, it's not like it's an unusable small dynamic range. It is still perfectly able to capture most scenes. You just have to be aware and take action as required. One thing I will point out though is that some people have reported that the noise performance of this might be partially impacted by the fact that the infrared filter is so weak, and thus some of the noise performance figures and or statistics look worse than they are. I am not sure if I super believe that, but we'll have a look at some samples of how this sensor does. On a random note, before we do look at said samples, the D2h actually also has auto ISO, which I appreciate when it's there. It is quite basic, either an on or off, and if it is on, it disables those boosted ISO ranges. So no 3200, no 6400. Okay, sample time. Let's have a look. In terms of noise, things are not looking particularly hot. I would probably peg the upper limit for this camera at around 800 for me personally, without noise reduction. With it'll work. 1600 will be fine generally, but it's actually a bit of a shame since one of the supposed benefits of said LBCAST was lower noise. But I really don't think that panned out. Even at the time that this camera was new, reviews pointed out that the noise didn't seem to push the boundaries of the day, with DP reviews specifically mentioning that it is about similar to the original Canon 1D. And when I put it up against the Canon D70, which is a budget Nikon camera produced less than 5 months after the D2h was released, the D70's performance, I think, even though it topped out at 1600 ISO, and it also offers 2 more megapixels than the D2h at the same ISO, at ISO 800, the D70 performs better. At ISO 1600, that difference becomes even more noticeable. On the D2h, you can see that there is more color noise, and since the pixels are actually just a little bit bigger, the luminance is also more prominent. So the D70 generally looks better overall in, I think, every regard. Now, I don't think the D2h is hugely worse, but it is noticeable and it is exacerbated by the lower resolution. When it comes to autofocus, the Multicam 2000 combined with the screw drive on the D2h, I think it's pretty fast with AFD lenses. The points on the Multicam 2000 also cover a pretty substantial part of the frame, which is also pretty nice. And it locks on very confidently and pretty speedily. Now, I haven't had any real issues shooting static objects. The camera's hit rate has been fairly solid. I'm also generally pretty happy to use the cross-type points other than the center on this camera, and they, again, are seemingly pretty reliable. When it comes to tracking, the system is pretty good for predictable motion, and the system itself is quite predictable. It reacts pretty quickly, and again, for simple things moving towards or away from you, you'd probably be able to track objects fairly well. Now, the one thing that I will note is that the AF points are kind of far apart, so when it comes to moving subjects going across the frame, the system will get tricked up. Sometimes I had seen the focus rack back and forth before kind of getting reacquired on what I was pointing at. But overall, it's an easy to predict system, and I'm sure if you learned it, you could do sports and action fairly well. Again, just like I say with all the other cameras of this era, it's not like using a modern mirrorless system that can track and focus on an ant doing a dance 100 feet away. But if you learn the system, I'm sure you could use this again to do many good sports shots. And when this camera was new, many excellent action and sport shots were taken on D2hs, which is good because the D2h has the shooting speed to back that up. Let's have a listen. That is awesome. That's the classic Nikon chunk-a-chunk. And I know what you're thinking. With all that chunk, I bet you can feel the shutter slaps and the mirror flaps. And yes, but it's pretty well dampened, and the substantial mass of the camera also helps smooth out the shutter feeling. Recommendation and conclusion. Do I recommend this camera? Sadly, generally, no. Here's why. For someone looking for a classic Nikon DSLR experience, there are better options at cheaper prices. There are better options at around what the D2h is going for. The D2h is really for someone who is looking to try the very unique sensor technology. But at least in my opinion, for me, there are too many other drawbacks to the D2h to easily recommend this. And let's have a chat about that. The camera can really live up to one of those promises that sensor was trying to accomplish: speed. And if you really want a classic speedy DSLR and nothing else, again, maybe this makes sense. 8 FPS on mechanical shutter of this era is cool, but noise performance is a bit of a miss. It doesn't stack up to cameras of even its own era. And for a guy who does a lot of old DSLR reviews, I know resolution isn't everything, but I also want to bring up that, again, this camera really, for me, straddles that line of useful and novelty. And again, I want to bring up, for web use, for small prints, things are going to be totally fine. It's still tons of fun to shoot, but I realized that when it came to editing my files, I couldn't shake the fact that when I tried to put the images on a modern display, I literally have no pixels to spare. Yes, the D2h pixels, they're fine pixels, and the sensor delivers on quality, but it's not to the point where it'll make up for being 4.1 megapixels. If the images suit you and you like it, go for it. But for me, it doesn't feel like the pixels are that good. They're not Kodak DCS 760 good. The 6 megapixel sensor on that really felt like it hit above the 6 megapixel resolution figure. Now, I still liked using the D2h, don't get me wrong, but I'm gonna be very honest. After this review, this camera is gonna sit. This battery is coming out of that camera and it's going right back to my D3S. And here's a couple other reasons why this camera is hard to recommend. The error message is seemingly something that affects a large number of units, and it still sometimes catches me off guard. Maybe if I wasn't some YouTube scrub switching between so many cameras, I'd adapt quicker, but here I am, failing to adapt. Additionally, these are professional workhorse cameras, so expect a lot of these to be fairly beat up. If you have a look at mine, the front looks pretty good, but if you look at the back, we are missing an ungodly amount of paint. And I'm sure some of that fogginess in the back of the rear LCD comes from some of the intense action that this camera has seen. Additionally, while I love shooting big square cameras as much as anyone else, again, great to shoot, they are annoying to pack, especially if you're someone that's coming from a mirrorless camera and only have bags that are suited for mirrorless cameras. Packing this big square thing is going to be annoying. All right, let's finally talk about the market price. Current rate online on the online marketplaces tends to hover between $125 and $250 dues. You can find in some online shops, they sell for around $175 USD or so, and you can get them cheaper if the charger isn't included. But if you do that, and you don't already have the charger for this battery, those can add to the cost significantly. Yes, you can still buy a third-party one, but they do tend to cost more than more common, smaller battery packs. Expect to pay at least $40 more dues for a third-party charger, and much more for a Nikon one. Batteries also tend to cost more than smaller packs, obviously because it's kind of big, but also they just made less of these things. And again, you can still get third-party EN/EL4s, but they are still, again, more than, say, an EN-EL3, which you can also still get, and they are very cheap. And I gotta reiterate, if you aren't looking for the LBCAST JFET experience, this camera probably isn't for you. I would honestly, if you're just looking for a classic Nikon camera, look at the D200, D300, and if you want that square feel, go grab the D300, go grab the battery grip, go get the EN-EL4 and put it in that grip, and now you have a big square body, and you can also get 8 FPS on that thing. And you'll also have it with a 12 megapixel APS-C sensor. So some pretty good resolution. And if you don't care about that and you just want the squareness of the D2H and you don't want it on a grip, have a look at the D2X. That is going for around the same price as the D2H. And again, you get a 12 megapixel APS-C sensor and you get the same camera body. Plus, you might also still get that authentic D2 experience and get the error message. Super authentic. There's one other scenario where the D2H makes sense, and it relates to when I talked about the flaws of the camera, and that is infrared shooting. Do you want an infrared camera that really doesn't require any camera mods to set up? This could be it. At $125, the D2H could make a very fun, very cheap infrared shooter. Sure, it isn't full-blown, full spectrum, but enough infrared leaks through that, as I mentioned, you can get pretty reasonable, almost hand-holdable shutter speeds, and all you need to do is put the right filter on top of your lens. Additionally, because it is a pro body, it'll actually meter manual glass, and the meter does generally work when you put the IR filter through, although it might not be the most reliable thing. You'll probably need to adjust and tweak anyways. It does still do its thing, or try to. Plus, if you're using older manual glass, those almost always have infrared markers on them, usually indicated by a little red dot. And that's just kind of a nice little win, because then it makes it easy for you to adjust focus for infrared if that's what you're going to shoot. The only other camera that I think had that much or this level of infrared leakage onto the sensor is the Leica M8, and that ain't cheap. So this is the next best thing. Anyways, that turns out was quite long. My A7 III overheated for a bit and I needed to take a break. But let me know what you think of the D2H. Have you ever wondered about this sensor? Otherwise, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks. And of course, check out Chang of Fools. Till next time, bye.